Study me as much as you like, you will never know me. For I differ in 100 ways from what you see me to be. This is Rumi, the Persian poet who lived from 1207 to 1273. When I first spotted these words a few months ago in my file that's marked Stereotyping, I thought everything old is new again, and the wisdom of the sages lasts throughout the ages. That, for me, is time binding at its finest. And we had such wonderful poetry yesterday. I just want to appreciate that out loud. I loved it. Stereotyping is a process that involves perceiving, abstracting, oversimplifying observations, and making generalizations and applying them to either an individual or a group. Since I believe it's never too early to learn about general semantics, I get going on the topic when young people have anything that plugs in to general semantics. So when my 6-year-old neighbors became fascinated with the word stereotype after overhearing it in the elevator, I came up with a simple explanation that would appeal to children. If you go to the neighborhood ice cream parlor every day for a week and you notice red-headed kids all order vanilla ice cream, you might conclude redheads like ice cream. Later, when a red-headed kid comes in and orders chocolate, you think that's the exception. We tend to confirm our original observations and believe that they're accurate. And we consider any contradictory observations as exceptions to the rule. This especially applies to stereotypes, and it's how they persist. We start with our observations based on some truth or observable behavior, and I think of this as truth minus X or X minus truth. We are dealing with partial data and attributing it to the whole situation or the whole group of people or to the whole whatever. General semantics tells us our maps are not the territory they represent, our words are not their referent. An understanding of how stereotypes operate reminds us none of us are purely anything. The theme of this conference is the tyranny of words. Stereotypes seem to line up with the tyranny of concepts. These lead to expectations that can only ever be partially valid. Stereotypes are a good example of a closed system perspective when an open systems approach is called for. Or as we often say in general semantics, think, etc., this applies to all communications, social and interactional processes. An understanding of stereotypes, how they work, becomes especially important in the electronic age, where bits of information bombard us at the speed of light and infiltrate the ecosystem of our mediated environments. They spread like a highly contagious disease. I think of these as social viruses that can be as deadly to the social glue of our society, the same way that the plague destroyed in the past historically. When we address stereotypes, we are addressing what Adelbert Ames, the pioneer of perception, calls our assumptive world. It is based on expectations. Ames tells us we only change our assumptions when we encounter a hitch. That causes us to question our original thinking. In this case, we might come across a person who doesn't fit our perceived ideas and change our perspective. If we are self-reflective and learn what general semantics has to teach us, we think about our thinking. This involves a three-pronged creative process: perception, abstraction, I'm truncating it a bit, categorizing our observations. Although this is a natural process of our brains, it is also the underpinning of stereotypes. And stereotypes are the underpinnings of hate speech. In the United States, hate speech is defined as talk that attacks a person or a group on the basis of constitutionally protected attributes such as race, religion, ethnic origin, national origin, sex, disability, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Hate speech as a type of talk can lead to discrimination or even violence based on prejudice against any particular category of people or any individual. Stereotypes can have both positive and negative connotations. They begin at the level of the individual observation and later become incorporated into the thinking and the culture of groups of people. That's where it gets dangerous. Here are a few common examples of positive stereotypes, since they can be positive and negative. Asians are good at math. African Americans are good athletes. Irish are good with words. Jews are smart and are bookish people. Italians are warm and friendly. They also eat pizza and pasta, and so on. Although these are positive, they can also cause harm by setting up expectations. Once these expectations enter the culture, they become more powerful. Negative stereotypes tend toward insidious labels, and we heard labels are liable, that also take on a life of their own. These can fuel hate speech and discrimination, usually directed at someone who's a member of another group. As soon as group identity is involved, it's cultural. This means we are focusing on the behaviors and beliefs of a group. That's important to note. Any individual member might not display any of those behaviors or beliefs. So we're back at an X minus truth scenario. Okay, I'm missing a page now. Okay, since I'm mostly Italian American, I'm also a smattering of Ashkenazi Jew and Irish and German and lots of things. I'll start by talking about Italian Americans and ask you to participate a little bit. Okay, we eat pasta and pizza, and we're all part of the mob. And we're not bookish, and we're not intellectual either.
Good hair.
What?
Good hair.
We have good hair. The Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn pay $4,000 for this good Italian hair. No kidding. And I actually grew some for cancer kids when they told me that. Okay, so I wrote a few sloppily down, but tell me, what are the stereotypical stereotypes? Irish are drinkers. They're also clannish, but I think we're all clannish. Italians, I told you. Jews, aside from being bookish, all of them are obsessed by money. So if you meet Professor Postman, who didn't care about money, you have an exception. Muslims now, since 9/11, are terrorists, and people really get upset about them. WASPs are uptight, formal, and snobby. Catholics are papists. They only follow the Pope, in spite of the fact that the birth rate in Italy is not at replacement rate. They're rigid and authoritarian, those Catholics. So you get the idea. And I can tell you, I taught this course for 6 months to the police department of New York City. And boy, did those guys and gals have plenty of stereotypes to throw at me. And I got one that I had never heard of. They're afraid of Puerto Ricans because they carry knives. Okay. All right, so now we know and we can believe stereotypes exist, and I think we believed that when we walked in the room. But I want to talk about that they are based on our brains, the process, the natural process of our brains. And I like that that dovetails with what you spoke about changing our brains this morning. What was the term? Epigenetics. Neuroplasticity. It really gives me hope. Okay, so So we know they exist. They're based on our brains. And I wanted to, I'm missing something. Okay, I'll remember what it is. We perceive 60,000 sensory perceptions per second. So our brains need to categorize and formulate that, otherwise we live in chaos. And that's how stereotypes start to work, and then they take on a life of their own and become a culture, part of a culture. But here, one last piece, because I think I'm getting time. In our society, we have both formal and informal structures influencing us. In the United States, hate speech is protected by our First Amendment rights. On the other hand, discrimination is against the law. These formal protections, based on our legal system, that's one thing. But our informal system is where things happen. That's where everything is usually circumvented. And we would say that we know about the informal system because gossip is deadly. And we need to pay attention to these levels. Wendell Johnson in Peoples and Quandaries tells us that we need to always look at the levels of analysis about what we're thinking. So once these negative stereotypes get started and they morph at the cultural level, they become more powerful. They emerge as the accepted beliefs of the group, and the group's thinking is you against me, and this leads to war in the final analysis, and killing and murder. So it's not a small problem. So once it's part of the culture, that's it. It becomes part of the style of living and the way of life, and the informal systems spread the little things that we're not supposed to do, and so on. So in summary, where general semantics makes us aware of the limitations of our process of abstracting, and I'll give you a handout about that, and knowing this helps us to think about our categorization, but also to forgive ourselves because it's normal, and to accept the fact that we have limitations as people and that we can't erase what we do. It's biological. So that's very important. And then culture, we have to live in a culture. We cannot survive without each other. And so we have that sense of belonging, and that, since it's survival, how important is it? It's like breathing, which we mentioned today. So, so at the cultural level, they do the most harm, but our groups teach us the rules of the road by reinforcing our beliefs, either positive or negative. We can, and how do they do it? Through positive and negative sanctions. We can be criticized, expelled, or shunned, or we could be praised. It doesn't get much more powerful than that. And in case this seems obvious, I remind you, Martin Levinson, in his book More Sensible Thinking, says scarcely anything is more difficult to learn than something that is obvious. And to close, in today's electronic world that operates at the speed of light, memes, tropes, values, attitudes spread instantaneously, the influence of this cannot be measured or accurately evaluated at this moment in history. We don't know where it's at. Although we are time binders, we're only at the beginning, and we don't have knowledge to pass on yet. So that's a very serious issue that I think we're all aware of. But I do believe that an understanding of the process of stereotyping, how it works and how it gets going, along with the illumination we get from general semantics that teaches us how to think about thinking and to remember what layer and level of analysis we're looking at, can help us grapple with that. And And I think that it can help empower us toward protecting ourselves from the exploitation of others, now exacerbated by media, and the exploitation of ourselves. This is a quote from Korzybski. This is especially important now that media competes with all our other institutions that socialize people, like our ethnic groups, our family, our religion, and so on, which is where we start originally. Thank you. I'll give you some